This is Worship Lit, Music 347. The date is April 21st, 2020, and this is part 2 of the class. All right, the style of worship we're going to talk about tonight in this second part of this class is emerging worship. And emerging worship is a different animal, but it is a product of the current Gen X's and Gen Y's, and it reflects current young culture. I think it's important as we start this discussion that you'll hear people say, well, I want to have a service that's culturally relevant. What they're actually saying when they say that is, I want to have a service that's culturally relevant for people between the age of this and this. So whenever we talk about being relevant, or we're talking about a shift or a change in what's going on in worship circles, or any circles for that matter, generally what we're talking about is a shift towards a younger audience. And so as churches shouldn't be, I pastored a church, and when you look out there, you see a lot of gray hair. And so when I'm up on stage leading worship, even though we do something that would fall under the category of contemporary worship, we're, in a certain sense, we're blended a little bit of the music, but really what we are is a product of contemporary worship. And that's had a large shaping of who we are. But we're, as a student once said to me, are you new contemporary or old contemporary? What he was actually asking is, are you contemporary or are you emerging? And we are contemporary. And contemporary is the old stuff, as all movements become old. So contemporary is yesterday's emerging. So today it's emerging church. 20, 30, 40 years ago was contemporary, was what the shift was going to. And I think you want to remember that, because it where you are right now in your careers, which is basically before they actually begin, you are coming into a situation where things are very fluid, and a lot of changes are occurring. And so anything we talk about, when this book was written, was 16 years ago. Emerging worship was the new what it was. Emerging worship has now been around long enough that I don't even hear people talking about emerging worship anymore. It's become the new contemporary worship. And so so words get tossed around, and I think words matter, semantics matter. But 20 years from now, this will be the old stuff. The new stuff we're talking about now will one day be old. The latest worship song that you're considering maybe adding, if you're doing any kind of worship leading or you're involved in worship in your churches, any brand new worship song just came out 2 weeks ago, and you think we really want to put this in the worship service, is destined to be old stuff in 5, 10, or 15 years. And Christ Alone is one that I use an example of. Christ Alone is a contemporary hymn, but it's a contemporary hymn written in 2006. So how long do we continue to call it a contemporary hymn? Can a contemporary hymn be a hymn that's 25 or 30 or 40 years old? So I think it's important to know that time continues to move on. And whatever we're talking about here, I think that the operative word is that you need to figure out who you are, what's important, understand that the world will always be changing, and so culture and style may change. The Word of God doesn't, and so we should see if God is unchanging and His truth is unchanging, then we should see elements of how we worship God very similar, expressed similarly, regardless of the style of worship we take on. So I just toss that out there for you to kind of chew on a little bit. So here's emerging worship. This is uh, chapter 6 in the book, and this is Sally Morgenthaler, and she has she has in her ministry has morphed. She was heavily into the emerging worship scene back in the maybe 10 or 15 years ago. She's now doing other stuff and is no longer at her church. She's now working for ministries. She's a professional nature photographer, and so um, she's still out there, but she's not as perhaps as prolific as she was when this book was written. So, but I just mentioned that because she's changed too. The essay reads. I mean, she's a fine writer, and the essay reads well. I think it's a very easy to read. I think it's one of the easiest essays to read in the book. Um, but it's pretty hard to pin her down on what she thinks. She gives examples of emerging worship, but she doesn't really say this is what it needs to be or this is what it should be in as clear a language is what I would like. But I think you have to tease apart the text and kind of read between the lines. So um, uh, let's look a little bit about what she says. So in her chapter, some of the major points here is that she says people are looking for something beyond the norm and outside of the church's presupposed box. Um, she talks about uh, uh, um, a prototype church. And when she talks about that prototype church, she's talking about churches that um, define the person they're trying to reach. So she would call a prototype church, if you get started with a church plant, it's almost, unless it's an emerging church, you're going to have a team. And of course, I want you to think about a church plant. That's what your essay is on. But as a team, you're going to sit around a table and you're going to look at each other and say, who's our target market? At some point, somebody's going to say, what is our distinctives and who are we trying to reach with this church? And the reason people ask that question is because society has become so fragmented. Um, I, people who look like me, maybe I'm, maybe I can appreciate more varied kinds of services. I'm finding a liturgical service. I'm finding a contemporary service. I'm not beholden to any particular style. But the average person isn't like that. The average person isn't a worship professional. The average person doesn't study this stuff out. So the average person likes what the average person likes. Some people like liver, some people don't. Some people like popular music, some people don't. Some people love hymns, some people don't. And so somebody who's my age might be looking for a church that's more traditional, maybe more interested in hymns. Somebody your age may be looking for music that Bethel would publish. And so, as you sit around a table and you're trying to decide what kind of church do I want to plant in this city, you're going to at some point in the conversation you're going to talk about style. You're going to say, well, who are we trying to reach? We're in a retirement community. We're trying to reach older people. Okay, well, let's go out and talk to them and see where they are in terms of politics and their Christian life and what do they expect from a church. Now I'm older, but I'm not that old that I couldn't appreciate a contemporary worship service. That is a contemporary worship. When I first started leading worship in my early 20s, it was a contemporary worship service. So contemporary worship was old contemporary worship was 40 years ago. There was contemporary worship. So I appreciate having a drum and maybe synthesizer, keyboard, bass player. That's all stuff uh, that I like and that I enjoy in a service. But I was raised as a little kid. I was raised in liturgical service in the Lutheran church when we had a church organ, and there was a church organ and there was a piano, and that was it. So that was my initial experiences in worship. So Uh, so emerging churches don't ask the question, who are we trying to minister to, or who are we heading for? They're and Sally Morgenthaler says we aren't prototype style churches. Those are, well, she's actually pretty demonstrative in how she deals with that. Those things are all bad, and her way is good. She's actually polemic in what she says, and there's her way, and then everything else is wrong. Now that's really not true, and the other people who critique her writing say basically the same thing: is that she's saying that her way is the only way, and it's really not. But the point here is that that helps us then take apart this emerging church phenomenon and say, okay, what exactly, if they're not trying to be a prototype church, if they're not trying to aim for a certain group of people, and they claim they're trying to aim for everybody, who is everybody in their mind? And I think really the question, before we really get into what she says, is she's trying to aim for everybody who isn't already part of a church. So if you're already part of a church, then she's not really interested in trying to pull you into what she's doing with her in her church. She's interested in reaching you if you're unchurched, truly unchurched, and part of a culture that's become very diverse, and that perhaps people who've never walked into a church service or a church before. So she says people looking for churches uh, that are acknowledging culture in the current and future state of the church within the U.S. Um, so the emerging church is for people looking for churches that are interested in the cultural diversity and what's happening in churches today. The churches, typical churches, kind of half the churches in the United States are in decline. So half the churches are in decline. So we're in a to put it crassly, we're kind of the church is kind of the industry of icebox makers or buggy whip makers when everybody's moving to refrigerators and cars. And so um, the now I don't truly believe that God's truth is eternal and timeless, but there is a sense that the church has outgrown its usefulness in the United States, and the church in the United States, at least, is hemorrhaging members, and so we're now whatever 47% of the population now claims to be a Christian. So she says the emerging church is not based on a model of married, white, standard American dream standards. Well, that would be the typical um, contemporary church. That is who the contemporary church is. The contemporary church emerged at a time when there wasn't the great sense of diversity that is operating now. So 40 years ago, 45 years ago, even and this even starts in the 60s and the 70s. The what comes out of the 60s and 70s is a contemporary church, and the that was a time when there were three TV stations, three main TV stations, and PBS, and that was it. And the reason that's important is there wasn't the fragmentation. We were a very homogenous culture, and that homogeneity is what allowed contemporary churches to grow out of what was traditional churches. There wasn't it didn't have to do much except change up the music a little bit and what people were wearing. Drop the robes and put on um, polo shirts and poof. Change the music up a little bit, get rid of the organ and put an electric guitar, and you have a contemporary worship service, a contemporary service. And that's all it took back then. Maybe a little bit more involved in that, but that's basically it. So, so Morgenthaler looks at that and says, "Well, that's that white married, 1.7 kids or 2.3 kids, suburbia." I think that's uh, probably more kind of typecasting than it should be, but that's society was what had was uh, hugely white and hugely European, and maybe 85, 87% of the population was white in the United States at that time. And so that's, of course, that's going to drive um, everything. Drove everything, TV shows and the design of cars and tasting cars and restaurants. It was all catering to the people that were in the country at that time. Things have changed dramatically. We've opened our doors. Lots of people come in from other countries, and we are a great land of opportunity. And so we do have a very diverse culture, and it's getting more diverse, not less diverse. Um, in addition to that, we've seen the norms of sexuality and marriage and what defines a family. All of that has changed, and we've gone from being a country that where 82 to 85% of people claim to be Christian, and half the Christians in the country went to church every Sunday, to a completely different climate and place where we are now. I lived through that. I saw that. When I was growing up, it was unusual that a person didn't go to church on Sunday. Everybody went to church. That's the way life was. So, Morgenthaler says that the emerging church is a process, it's a spiritual journey. It recognizes personal and societal brokenness. We are a society of broken. The standard, again, 40 years ago, 50 years ago, the families were made up of a mom, a dad, and a couple kids. That was a family. There were certainly single people, but single people tended to be grandma because grandpa died, or it would have been somebody. And divorce was very rare. I think certainly when I was 12 or 13, I knew of one family where the husband and the wife had divorced and remarried. Knew of one in the uh, greater part of our neighborhood. People didn't get divorced back then. Now there were other problems, plenty of other problems, but the culture was so uh, the drive within the culture. Culture said, "Don't get divorced," and that was an extension of the church saying, "Don't get divorced," and most everybody was going to church, and so the that's changed dramatically as the church lost its authority in the lives of people. People said, well, it started by people saying, well, doesn't God want me to be happy? So I'm going to get a divorce because I'm not happy. And then it led to, well, I got a divorce and I'll be even happier if I get rid of God too. And, um, and that's the situation we find ourselves in now. Now, obviously, there are plenty of people who are Christians, and I have a wife. I haven't I've never cheated on my wife, and she's never cheated on me, and we've never been divorced, and we have 6 kids. And I'd like to tell you everything is, we have the Leave It to Beaver family. Everybody's happy and everybody's married, but that's not the case. I have uh, one child who's my 2 youngest are not ready to get married. Then I have a child that's in his late 20s who probably won't get married because he would rather not be married. And then I have a child who's been divorced, and I have uh, out of my 6 kids, there's one. One of those kids is a unit that is a family that's a traditional family: mom, dad, and 5 kids. It's a set of 4, uh, set of quads, but 5 kids. And so in terms of that kind of tradition, that's out of 6 kids. I only have one that qualifies for that. The other 5, um, well, two that are still too young for that, but the other um, 3 are what would be called non-traditional families, except that that's now the new traditional family unit. Go figure, but that's the way it is. So personal and societal brokenness. 9/11 was part of the movement's force in recognizing how fickle the American ideal was in this world. We were attacked, and I wouldn't say that um, the American ideal was that fickle. I think the American ideal, from my point of view, from a baby boomer point of view, I still think the American, the thing that resonates with me is um, that once upon a time America was a great country, and we were recognized for that, and we weren't ashamed of it, and weren't afraid of it, and that's no longer the case now. What 9/11 was is it showed that our borders were porous, and uh, we could be attacked, and it definitely shook up people in this country and said we're not as safe as we thought we were. So, but she does use that as one of her points. So we're talking about in the emerging church a realignment. She talks about realignment, substance over style, and that includes musical, presentational, etc. A creator, God-focused expressions, engaging worshipers with the person of Christ through Jesus. It begins with who God is rather than what we think people need, not based on consumerism, but on those seeking their story within God's story. It is not a mental lesson, but one that is a narrative. It is dramatic, it is experiential, and it's fixed on the character of God. I think there's an important point here to be made, and that is the church, the contemporary church, is focused on meeting people's needs. So people come to the church and they say, I have this issue or this problem, or I'm depressed, or I feel this way, or I'm having trouble in my marriage, and they come to the church for healing. And so, when I was a younger person and I was involved with churches, some church plants and some church resurrections, we thought of ourselves in terms of a hospital where people come to get spiritually better, and it's the sense of meeting people's needs. That is not the emerging church. The emerging church is more about, and it's funny because the emerging church has much more in common in terms of content as the liturgical church, and that is the emerging church is looking at the person of God, and how we can, as worshipers, engage the person of God and His holiness, and connect with that. And so it's more experiential, it's more feeling oriented, and it's more about God as opposed to me. So when people talk about contemporary music and they'll say, well, there's a bunch of I's and me's in this contemporary music. There is some truth to that. There is. I can show you lots of hymns that have I um, in them, which would be me focused. But that is not at all untypical in contemporary music. Contemporary music is often focused on me, on the person. And so you will see I in me. And that is a natural uh, outgrowth of a church that is interested in meeting people's needs. And so, if I were starting a contemporary church service, I might get a group of people together and go out and canvass a neighborhood and ask questions. And so the questions might be: do you attend a church? Have you ever considered God's truth? Would you be interested in marriage, a study on marriage, or a study on raising teens? That's a big one. How to raise your teenager. Okay, so the there are churches all across America that have been built on doing series of messages with subjects like how to raise your teenager, because everybody's struggling with that. Teenagers don't come with an owner's manual, and so when you none of you are raising teenagers, but one day probably most of you will, and you can look back at this tape and say, "Wow, that was pretty." Pretty forward-looking of me to tell you that when you're raising teenagers, there you'll start to grab for books to try to figure out what you're supposed to do as a parent, even though all parents used to be teenagers, but that is just the way it works. So that's where the church, the contemporary church, tapped into that. Emerging church doesn't. It's not based on that sense of selling having your needs based. That's not what sells it. So it is about it is about creating an environment where you experience God. Now, we talked about experiential worship, and that is certainly part of the charismatic church, the experience, experiencing God, experiential worship, having an emotional meeting with God. And that emotion means that I had a legitimate, authentic experience because I felt something. And that's how the charismatic church thinks. That is how, and that part of the charismatic church has definitely spilled over into contemporary worship services. Well, here we are with emerging worship, and experience again is part of what makes them up. It's experiential. But in terms of this, it's not nearly as much about pushing emotional buttons as much as it is about experiencing an event that draws you closer to God or that makes it more meaningful. And we'll talk a little bit, maybe talk a little bit about that right now. That's where you're going to see, as she describes, that they're putting butcher paper on the wall and you're coloring things on the wall, or you have some kind of uh, activity that represents something. And so art is important. Um, Participation by the congregants is important. Splitting people up into groups is important. You might rearrange the chairs. Maybe the chairs are rearranged in a circle. Maybe maybe you have people broke. Maybe people break off into subgroups and they're doing activities in subgroups. And so it doesn't look anything like a typical contemporary service, but it is very much into the uh, variations on expression that are only limited by a person's creativity, which is part of the downfall. We'll talk about that in a second here. So all of this stuff is going on, and so it's realignment, and then she says context. Context, connect people with the church's history and use it in totally different and creative ways. Showcase paradox and eclecticism, multiple things happening at once rather than an ordered service. And she talks about stations. So you might have an activity over here, you might have an activity over here, you might have another one over here. And then borrowing and then totally reinventing ideas and orders and other things from other church worship styles. Okay, so these stations. So an emerging church would be more like if there was something to relate it to. When you were growing up, maybe your parents took you to like a science museum. When I was younger, we every once in a while would go into the Museum of Science and Industry in Chicago. Here in Kansas City, there's a museum, a hands-on science museum down at the Union Station. And what these are is a series of exhibits, hands-on, that you're involved with. And you go to that exhibit and you experience some aspect, in this case of science. Maybe it has to do with the properties of light, or maybe it's working with one exhibit in Kansas City here has a series of pulleys and how you can change the amount of force it takes to lift an object by changing the ratio of the gears and the pulleys and things like that. Maybe there's a big sandbox and there's little dinosaurs that are buried in the sand, and you're supposed to go do an excavation and find dinosaur bones and stuff in this thing. And so it's what it is it's these activities that engage the mind and the physical aspects of kids. They come in and deal with this stuff, and it makes a big impact on them. That's the emerging church. The emerging church is like this big science museum where people are going to these various different stations and they're having these experiences that are very unique to them at that moment, at that time, at that station. And you have somebody else at another station experiencing something else over here. And what it is this sense of discovering who God is. Now, there isn't somebody up at the front saying, "This is God, thus saith the Lord." Here are 3-point sermon. This is people engaging in activities that reveal God to them. Well, there's some good about that, and there's some bad about that. But that's a matter of fact. One of the folks that criticized Morgenthaler's essay, said, I want to go to a church like that. I want to experience God like that. I want to have that kind of experience, but I only want to do it once or twice a year. I wouldn't want to do it every week. If I did it every week, I'd burn out on it. It would be too much. But to have that kind of impact in my life once or twice a year, well, it's the same thing. I'd love to go to the Nelson Atkins Museum down on by the plaza. It is a beautiful museum. It's one of the best museums in the world. I have lived here for over 20 years in Kansas City, and I've been to the museum 3 times. So I love the museum, but I don't go down every week. I go down when my brain and my heart are right, and I want to go in and experience that stuff. And I love the museum, but I love the museum occasionally. And so I think that kind of comes out as we look at some of the critiques here. Okay, and then as far as borrowing and then totally reinventing ideas, if there were one word that I would use to kind of describe the putting these services together, it would be uber or ultra creativity. Lots of creativity involved. And then Morgenthaler talks about particularity, and that this is not a prototype ministry. She says we don't want to get together with people that are just like us. We want to promote and experience diversity. And that is certainly culturally right now. If we sat down and we were in a class and we were talking, diversity would be part of your vocabulary. Um, uh, it's not. It is part of my vocabulary because that is where we are culturally. But that isn't where we were 40 years ago when the contemporary church was rising. 40 years ago, there wasn't a desire, a need, or even a conversation much about diversity. It was a little bit, but there wasn't. We weren't a diverse culture. We are now, and so much to the point that the whole conversation about diversity, not that it's not important, but it's probably run its course because now it's become part of our natural um, uh, psyche. So we naturally think of diversity now, and uh, you no longer have to force the issue. It comes up naturally. We're naturally going to talk about these things um, much more so than we used to. But talk about issues of diversity and bringing in diverse types of people into our churches. We actually, as an elder, I've sat in the church. We're a very white church. We have typically at any time um, maybe 2% of our body is African American. Maybe 1% is something other than white or African American. That's who we are. We're a very old church. Probably average age in the church is 50 or 55. We have lots of young people. We have little kids, but the largest age group in the church are people older than me, people over maybe the age of 65. So and every one of them, all the old people are white, and they come out of a traditional service mindset. So, but the what the emerging church wants is they want the church to reflect. They want the church to appeal to a diverse group of people. They're not target marketing people. They want a diverse group of people. I guess that is their target. Is people. Uh, they want to be able to say, I have a church that's very diverse. And from that, they want to allow the people that make up the church to come up with how they should be worshiping. So they want the worship to emerge from the cultural awareness of the people within the church. Now it's interesting. There is when we first came to Kansas City, so maybe 20 years ago, we were looking for a church. We chose. Now this is how diversity works. When we came from Las Cruces, New Mexico, and in Las Cruces, New Mexico, I was a minority. So Las Cruces, New Mexico, New Mexico is one of the 50 states. For those of you who don't know the Southwest, it's not Mexico, it's New Mexico, right next to Arizona, between Arizona and Texas. When we uh, when we came to Kansas City, we chose our neighborhood specifically because there were African Americans living there on that street. Because the Midwest at the time was so segregated, not officially segregated, but whites hung with whites and blacks hung with blacks, and that's the way it was. Now, we came out of Las Cruces, New Mexico, where 35% of the population was Caucasian, was white European. That's me. My wife, on the other hand, has a Hispanic background. It's 55% of the population in Las Cruces is Hispanic. So I was a minority there, and so my kids are about an eighth or a 16th Hispanic, and Spanish is what it is. They're of Spanish descent, but that qualifies them as Hispanic. That's why the government does. So when we moved here, we wanted to make sure that the kids didn't lose their sense of culture, um, their Hispanic culture, and the culture of the deep Southwest, which is very Hispanic. So where we lived, we had when we went out for dinner, we went to a restaurant. Now you would call the restaurant Mexican. You'd say that's a Mexican restaurant. We didn't call them Mexican restaurants. We called them restaurants because everything was Mexican. Everything was a Mexican restaurant, and it was you might have a steakhouse that wasn't Mexican, but most general restaurants were Mexican, and so it wasn't a special trip to go to the Mexican restaurant there. Some sign there you had signs that were some signs were in Spanish, some signs were in English, and so it was a very rich. And Las Cruces still is very rich culturally and very exciting. They have a mayor who is Japanese. So um, all of these things going on. Now, a lot of that has to do with the fact that there's a major university in Las Cruces. But we moved here and we looked at a number of different neighborhoods, and the neighborhoods were overwhelmingly white. And it wasn't that we didn't like white people, it's that we didn't want our kids growing up in a completely white neighborhood, which meant that all of their friends would be white and all their experiences would be with white kids specifically. We wanted them to be culturally rich. And so for us, that's what diversity is. So we ended up on a street where there were maybe 10 families or 12 families, and two of those families were African American. We've lived here 20 years, and now maybe half the families on our street is African American. And uh, but we're all older people, so there just aren't kids on our street anymore. But so that in terms of diversity, um, that's kind of what the emerging church is looking for, is this kind of melting pot, people coming from different places. Now, I will say that when we got here, and I'm trying not to, I don't want to go down too much of a rabbit trail, but we looked for a church that we hoped would represent the diversity of the community. When we're in Las Cruces, the we attended churches that in a town where 55% of people are Hispanic. Your friends, your neighbors, the people you go to church with, your pastor, there's a very high chance that they're going to be Hispanic, and so Hispanic was the dominant culture in that area. And so all the churches we attended had a predominantly Hispanic slash white had those congregations, and there was never any sense in any of those congregations of being white versus being Hispanic. There was no sense of ethnic differences, and because of that, if you might have out of that maybe 2 or 3 or 4% of people were African American, and along with that, there really wasn't any sense of massive differences in terms of culture, race, things of that nature. So to move to Kansas City, where it was so deeply segregated by race, there are whole sections of town that were 98% black, and whole sections of town that were 98% white. We didn't want that for our kids, and we didn't want that in a church. So we looked for a church that was white and black, and what we found was all churches that had a combination of whites and blacks, whites and Caucasians and African Americans, were predominantly black styles of worship, gospel type worship. And so we couldn't find a church that had a diverse congregation that also had diverse worship styles. There were white churches, there were black churches, and then there were mixed uh, ethnic churches, but they acted like black churches. So there wasn't any in between, which was kind of disappointing because we were looking for the same kind of church family that we had in Las Cruces, where there wasn't a sense of that dramatic of a sense of style. So um, that's what emerging church is looking for: is a sense where you don't have where everybody's involved with creating that worship experience. Diversity is valued and encouraged, but there isn't one um, a cultural ideal that overrides another cultural ideal. All of those things are valid. Um, all cultural input is valuable in the worship service. I hope that helps make some sense out of this. Okay, so that is the Morgenthaler chapter. I would urge you to go back and read more about it, and uh, and depending on where you live, depending on the community that you live in, you will see when you look at the modern church, you're going to see typically a lack of diversity. Numbers are important. How many people were here last week, and how many people were here 2 weeks ago, and are we growing or are we declining? I keep track of attendance at the church that I pastor at, and so those are important for a typical contemporary church. It's performance based. It's looking for the perfect model for the people it's trying to minister to. This is not Morgenthaler's ideal. This is what she's trying to move against. Um, it is a safe church in terms of you're not going to go there and have your senses violated. So you're not your sensibilities aren't going to be offended in a typical contemporary church. It's going to be creative, but it's going to be very carefully creative within certain boundaries. It's going to be stuck in the past, and the past is still contemporary. But the people who started these contemporary churches in their 20s are now in their 60s, and they haven't changed. They're still running the church the same way. Um, and it's still going to idealize make America great again. It's still going to be this idea of this American worldview, and that everything kind of is our sense of, I mean, right now, a sense of isolation is very strong. Um, and that there are these, that the separation of races, which is going on quite heavily in the United States. There's a sense of cultural separate ethnic groups, and so that's all the church that she's trying to fight against. So you want to think of what she's trying to do as the opposite of that, and a lot of that is true in certain parts of the country. In other parts of the country, like where I came from, we didn't need the emerging church to diversify. We were already diversified, and there wasn't any sense of this kind of racial tension. There was no racial tension where I lived. Um, None. It just does not exist down there. Um, so her thoughts on alignment, realignment, and uh, the church. Um, she talks about focusing on the character that is Jesus, um, and story and narrative, and this kind of sense of experiential. The problem is there is in doing that, in trying to engage God through these varied experiences, there isn't that sense of systematic training in who God is. I go to a Bible church. It doesn't say Bible church. It's really kind of more like an evangelical free church in terms of doctrine, but we do expository Bible teaching. So pastor takes a chapter for the next 4 months. We're going to be in this chapter, in this book, and he teaches straight through the book. And so we are a church that focuses on what does the Bible say. That's not emerging. That's not the emerging church. The emerging church is into these experiences, and you kind of tease away. You get this kind of idea of God over time by experiencing different aspects of who He is. The problem with that is that do you ever fully? What if you miss something? Do you ever fully engage the person of God if you aren't actually studying His Word? And so I think a lot of that is missing in the emerging church. And because of that, the emerging church is the birthplace for lots of heresy. So there's a lot of stuff. And when you talk emerging church, a lot of times you'll hear people talk about the emergent church. Those are really separate, but the emergent church and the emerging church are actually linked. But out of that point of mind or frame of mind, you're going to end up with things like, yeah, abortion is okay, homosexual marriage is okay, um, uh, sex outside of marriage is okay as long as you don't go sleep with a lot of different people if you're just sleeping with one person. And those are all ideas that are coming out of these churches that are experiencing God and trying to come up with the truth um, uh, by what they experience about God instead of actually reading in the Bible what it says. So I think there are definite problems with the emerging church, and if a church, not all emerging churches, but if they aren't addressing these things, I think that's where ultimately you're going to end up with some really strange ideas. That's where there is no hell. That you'll hear that, or there isn't eternal suffering or damnation. You'll hear ideas about everyone eventually goes to heaven. That's all heresy, but that's all. There are churches that are propagating that, emerging churches that are propagating that. So I would caution you against it. There's some really attractive things about this, I think, and things that you can tease out of this that you can end up putting into a regular church service that you might be involved with. But there are definite problems in the emerging church. The churches tend to be lay-driven, and so you have to ask, what is the role of the pastor, the deacon, the worship leader? What songs do you sing in the emerging church? Uh, you don't hear her talk at all about communion and breaking of bread, and you don't hear her talk about what is absolute truth. Well, the Bible is absolute truth, but that is not important. That is not as important in the emerging church as experience. What are you experiencing? What does your truth tell you? And so I want to say this as as I can as I continue with my comments about what she's written. Things I want to mention. Society has changed dramatically. Absolutely. Society today is nothing like it was 40 years ago. But I can tell you, society 40 years ago was nothing like it was 80 years ago. Society has changed dramatically. It will continue to change. Right now, individuals have become much more self-centered. And if you have me with some other classes, you'll hear me say the phrase, this is the most narcissistic generation that has ever lived. And in truth, that is exactly what it is. What has happened. I'm not saying you're all narcissistic, I'm saying that the generation is narcissistic. This is a generation that's been raised on Facebook and cell phones and Twitter, and people are saying, "I'm going to have lunch at 3 o'clock at um, Raising Cane's," as if anybody actually cares that you're going to be there at Raising Cane's having lunch at 3 o'clock. But we talk about our lives and we post about our lives and take pictures of what we're doing. And here I am at the grocery store with so and so. We're watching this movie together. Now it's very relational, and that's cool because my generation isn't nearly as relational. But my generation also wouldn't be terribly interested in what somebody else was doing at any particular time in their life. We've all become, um, maybe greater extent or lesser extent, it's like living as a character in a movie. And so we're desperate for attention. And we get that attention by posting outrageous videos on YouTube, clickbait. How many people can I drive to my YouTube video? We go to Facebook. How many friends do you have on Facebook? Well, I have 3,437. Oh, well, I only have 3,010. And so, how many friends you have? You want everybody to be your friend. Why? Not everybody. Look, you're only going to have 3 or 4 great friends the whole course of your life. I can count the number of best friends I've ever had probably on one hand. I don't want any more than that. I don't need any more than that. I have lots of acquaintances. But the but having friends, having people look at your Twitter feed, posting Instagram stuff, and posting your opinions about things, and thinking that people actually care, when actually all you're doing is you're posting to people who feel the same way you do, and you're not changing anybody's mind, and they're not changing your mind, and so we become these kind of we become slaves to this kind of social media stuff, um, and it 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 spills into everything we do. So older generations actually see the world differently than younger generations. Things that are important to younger people aren't nearly as important to older people, and things that are important to older people, vice versa. And so when we look at the emerging church, we say, okay, well, the emerging church is this kind of new ideal about how to craft a worship service, um, experiential, which is about self, um, concerned about how I'm experiencing God, and it's an extension of the contemporary services that talk about my needs. Now it's not about my needs; it's about my experiences with God. It's still me focused, but really, um, this changing environment is when we aren't we just trading one problem when a church. So a church might be a church service, a traditional contemporary church service is designed by a guy who used to be 20 and things haven't changed and now he's 60. Okay, so we could call him an old guy or we could call him a traditionalist. So he's designing those contemporary services and he's a traditionalist. And somebody over here is designing an emerging service and they're this new exciting young idealist. How is one of those better than another? Aren't we just trading aren't we just trading this set of issues with another set of issues? Aren't we just actually saying, okay, well, this is we no longer value this style of worship, so now we're going to have this style of worship because this is better. Why is it better? Because it's different. Is different really better? And I think that there's a number of questions that come up because Morgenthaler actually is making claims that the way things used to be done is dead and it's lifeless. Now, that's what the contemporary church said about the traditional church. Contemporary worship rose up from the traditional worship because traditional worship was dead and it was okay. Well, now she's saying that about the contemporary church. And so all churches can fall into a rut. Any church can fall into a rut. Um, and with any movement, you'll have one or two people or one or two churches that define the movement. They'll be very successful. Then you'll have a bunch of people come in and try to imitate them with maybe lesser success. And then after that whole way of thinking gets established, maybe third generation churches are not. So I would urge you as you think about church and church services um, to not think one of these is better than another. Okay? So, and we'll probably talk some more about that at some point in the future. Um, but now, what is she doing in this service? So, as you design your church service, here are some things to consider. It's free form. It's varied experiences. Um, she looks for excitement, um, and uh, it is anything but simple. Okay, so it is a different type of experience. Now, I would say, with all of that, I am a worship professional, and I'm telling you that what she does or what she's um, um, suggesting we do for emerging church would be very difficult. It's not difficult to pull off once or twice, or to do it twice a year. This would be very difficult to produce week after week after week. You'd have to have somebody who has an amazing level of creativity. And you would have to have an amazing group of people to pull this off. So when she talks about setting up all these different stations and having an artist do such and such on the stage and doing something over here and something artistic and maybe a light show over here, that is a lot of work. And it's not likely that you're going to find a church that can actually pull that off. So the ideal is, the idea of it, it's pretty cool, but to actually pull it off would be tough. Um, these services are not simple. What happened to simplicity? The early church, the first century church, was very simple. They got together, they had communion, they engaged in prayer, they sang songs, they took up a collection, um, they read scriptures, and the word of God was proclaimed. I have verses on all of those, and I can give you the verses if you want them, going from Acts 27 all the way to through 1 Corinthians, Colossians, Ephesians, and back to Acts. So the what happened to simplicity? I don't know that God says it has to be simple, but these services are complex. That's why you're used to simple services. So as you design your service, it shouldn't say opening, 3 songs, message, prayer, closing song, benediction. That is not an emerging service. So if you need more help, again, I posted a um, uh, a link to a site that talks about what goes into an emerging service. Now, I will tell you this. Uh, the reason you're going to have a hard time finding somebody who says, here are the elements of an emerging service, it's because there aren't any prescribed elements to an emerging service. It's just about experience. So you get to be creative with this, and as you design your service, you have these intentionally diverse experiential types of experiences that are going to take people through and direct them to trying to engage the person of Christ, and to the Godhead. Okay, so that's your service. This is probably the toughest one to put together unless you are already thinking like an emerging church person. And according to Morgenthaler, you all are, because you're in that age group. So she would say, since you're in that age group, you understand this fully, and you're going to put it together and you're going to run with it. Now, we'll see what happens. It'll be an experience and an experiment. Okay. Um, the other styles mentioned in the book all promote a certain style, more or less. There's a certain style to it. Is routine really a negative? Is it really a negative to have services that look alike each Sunday? I actually find it a source of comfort and confidence. So it certainly makes my job easier too. And when does Morgenthaler, what she's doing, when does what she does also become routine? Because if you have a church and they try to do this new kind of stuff every week, it won't be long and they'll be repeating certain things. They'll do something, they'll have success with it, and say, that worked so well, let's do that again. Because eventually you run out of ideas. So I'm just saying at some point her stuff will become routine too. We want to be bigger. We want to be part of something bigger than us. We want to matter and we want to be challenged, but we want a safe place. Ultimately, we need to center our lives around God. When I'm focused on God, style, physical trappings, all those experiences all seem to lose their importance. They may work as a catalyst to point me to God, but it's God that loved me first, and He sent His Son to die for me, and then He made me part of His family. What matters more than that? Now, she says this is how you come to an understanding of that. I would tell you that I can come to an understanding of that in a traditional service or liturgical service. I don't have to do what she's suggesting, which is just kind of blow everything up and start all over again. Um, and I want to end with this in my comments. The truth is that people are people are people. So a 20-year-old may relate to the world differently than an 80-year-old, but they are more the same than they are different. We are more the same than we are different. We're driven by the same spiritual, the same physical, the same mental needs. We love, we hate, we get jealous, we're happy, we're sad, we laugh, we cry, we get coronavirus, we throw up when we have the flu. The majority of us like ice cream. We are basically the same kinds of animals. And at our core is a struggle between, on this hand, faith, hope, and love, and on this hand, money, sex, and power. Life is about being part of God's family or not being part of God's family. When you're not a part of God's family, sin is pretty much the lust of the eyes, the lust of the flesh, and the boastful pride of life, which is money, sex, and power. When you are part of the family, what drives you is faith, hope, and love. And that is the core of our struggle of our humanity. And God has the answers for the lust of the eyes, the lust of the flesh, and boastful pride of life. And to understand that doesn't take a particular style of worship. It just takes the truth, the Bible. It's simple. So, you get to design the emerging service, though. And you're doing it as, in doing that, I want you to engage what this is actually about. So you may say, wow, I really love this emerging style of worship, and that's the kind of church I want to minister in. Super. Go do it. Just be true to the word. And I'd say go for it. On the other hand, you may do this and say, whoa, this is unnecessary. Or this isn't really, we're going to get stuck in the structure and the form of this and completely miss what we're actually trying to do, which is share the gospel. So, comments on from the other writers. Zal's response is insightful. The liturgical response. He says, emerging worship boils down to reinventing the wheel and make it up as you go along style of church. I think there's truth to that. And then he says, is everybody going to be comfortable with the emerging church experience? Some people will, some people won't. Some old people will love emerging style services. Some people, old people won't. Some people will love emerging style services. Some people won't. It depends on the personality of that person. I found personally the contrast between liturgical and emerging quite startling. Can there be a best model? Is that possible? Is there actually a best worship model out there? we'll talk about that more perhaps next week, following week. Um, in truth, the emerging movement can often fail to acknowledge sin and deliverance over people that are discovering it. And I think that's valid. Okay, a traditional response. Best response says, what exactly is the emerging church emerging from? Is there absolute truth? Well, there is. Why don't we just say what the absolute truth is instead of trying to figure out what it is through experiences? Is she correct about saying that that about the exponentially diversifying culture? Is that actually true? Is culture actually exponentially growing in diversity? And if it is, how can anyone keep up with that? Wouldn't matter what, can she keep up with that? She can't. And the church, if that is true about the church, and that our job is to continue to morph to reflect diversity in culture, we're doomed. We'll never be able to keep up with it if culture's changing that much. And truly, isn't it our right for church to have a different culture than the rest of society? Yeah. He uses traditional worship. He uses the example of the 2002 Olympics actually against her. She sees this beautiful diversity on display. Go back and watch the opening of the 2002 Olympic Games. So she sees this beautiful expression of diversity. He sees it as commercialized, stylized, and non-authentic expressions of culture. So it's like going to Taco Bell and thinking you're getting Mexican food. I grew up in Illinois, but I lived in the Southwest for 20 years. I'm telling you, Taco Bell is not Mexican food. Disney World, if you've ever been to Disney World has a whole area called World Showcase. They bring in products, build buildings from other cultures. They'll have a pavilion called Spain. They have one called England or Britain. They have one for China. They have one for Canada. So they have all these different countries represented. And so in the course of this little bitty area, you can walk in, go to a restaurant from that country, deal with clothes from that country. They have shops that sell stuff from that country. Everybody that works in those areas come from those countries. So everybody that works in the China pavilion comes from China. Everybody that works in the Canadian pavilion comes from Canada. So if you've been to Disney World, you know what I'm talking about. If you haven't, Google it. But through all of that, everything has been Disneyfied. So when you go to the Canada pavilion, you're talking to Canadians, you're looking at Canadian goods, you're in buildings that are designed like the buildings in Canada, but it isn't really Canada. It's fake. It's not authentic. England, China, Germany, they're not real. They're Disneyfied. It's the best of it. It's a caricature of what is true. So it's like going to the carnival and the artist draws a picture of you that looks like you, but it's not you. It's just a caricature. That's what Disney does. I think that's what the emerging church might be doing also. Not true expressions of diversity, but Disneyfied expressions of diversity. There's always that danger that you're going to end up producing this kind of sanitized, safe view of multiculturalism. And that's really not the way culture works. Where's the traditional response continues, where's the theology? Where's the word? The word is hidden. It's not blatant like it is in a Bible church. And he also says, how can one person be as creative as the emerging worship requires? I can't imagine. And then he takes issue with the fact that she harshly criticizes other styles of worship. Contemporary worship response. This is Hornis from Willow Creek. He actually knows Morgenthaler, and he says I think he's slightly put off and says she doesn't really understand the changes that contemporary worship has made in the last 10 or 15 years, and says that she's bashing contemporary worship, and she really shouldn't be, because contemporary worship is becoming more emerging like. Let's see. Yeah. We continue, almost done here. Charismatic response. He does feel that her essay is polemic. It's a strong attack on other styles, and he doesn't appreciate that. He argues that the example she gives at the beginning of her chapter with the guy whose wife is drinking and issues with the kids, and does he really want to go lead worship at his church? He actually says maybe this guy isn't even a Christian. So I don't know anybody like that in the worship business where the wife is drinking too much. Now I'm sure they're out there, but I can tell you I know a lot of other worship pastors, and we're all pretty boring people. So there are certainly issues in the industry, but not to the extent that she seems to imply. She's building a straw man there with that. And then he says there are many ways to express the gospel. There are many ways to structure a worship service. Hers isn't the only. Hers could be very effective, but it isn't the only way to do it. And then the blended worship person says, he says, Morgenthaler pushed the envelope, and she's pushing the envelope with emerging worship. She's just pushing it in the wrong way. And he says, and I do agree with this, he says, the type of service she describes will produce burnout in those attempting to create a new experience each week, along with a group of worshipers that arrive to something new as well. How can that possibly be sustainable? So I think the issues of culture are important. I think the issues of diversity are important. I think much can be learned from the churches that we frequent, and as we look at the emerging church, and we can say what are the truths here, or what are the good things here that we can pull out and apply to the services and to the churches we're servicing, that we're involved in. And things should challenge us. And I would just tell you, I would just suggest to you that you read them all carefully. Don't think one is better than the other, but do think about how do you see yourself plugging into a worship ministry, and how and what are the issues that you see the church faces. My view of the church is from the view of a pastor, a working pastor at a local church. So when I think of the church, immediately I think of the church that I pastor. And there are very specific issues that we have as a church that aren't necessarily reflected in the church at large. And so my first and foremost responsibility is to try to address the issues at the church that I pastor at as best I can. So beyond that, perhaps my community, and then beyond that, my city, my country, and the world. So we minister locally. That's where our ministry is. And so think about the churches you're attending now. Think about the issues. There are good things about the churches you attend, and there are probably some issues with the churches you attend. Think about how you can help promote the good things about the church you're at, and think about how you can help with the issues of the church you're at. There may be some truth here in this book and the other book that you've read that would help you make a difference in your church experience, in the church that you're ministering at. But ultimately, we need to be true to God. That's style is secondary to the truth. And I'll leave everything. I'll leave it with that. You know what you need to do for next week. We'll have a discussion next week on that chapter, and a few other things, and we'll close out this class 2 more weeks. So we have next week, the following week, and we are done. So be safe, stay sane as you continue to, wherever you are, as you continue to hunker down, and um, I just continue to pray for you guys. If you have questions, give me an email. Let me know what's going on. So see you next week.